Okay, so thanks very much for the invitation, and it's really wonderful to be here. And as Alison said, I've really enjoyed the insight into the community over the last couple of days. It's a really hospitable community, and it's a really close community here at PebbleBash. The talk that I wanted to give today is the title's up there, Fundamental Tensions in Supporting Future Ready. I hope, after discussing it with Shane and Alison, to be a little bit provocative, but there's always a danger when you sort of turn up to a conference in a community that you don't know, that you're really going to tell people how to suck eggs, you know, that all I've got to say you already know. So my apologies in advance if that's the case. This is where I come from, the University of Melbourne. It's what we call a sandstone institution in the Australian context. It's an institution on the edge of what is regarded as one of the most livable cities in the world. And this is what going to university is like at the University of Melbourne, which seems to be a lot of kids sitting around the sandstone. And I'm not sure how much learning is happening there, but arguably quite a bit. And I'm not sure how much that is preparing them for the future, but that's certainly the topic of the talk today. What relationship the university has with preparing graduates, it's always had some role in preparing graduates, and what it means to be future ready. And when I started to think about what this was, I of course went straight to YouTube and shoved #FutureReady into YouTube, and there's a lovely video here from a school district in North America that prepares us for Future Ready. You can also see the other things that I tend to look at on YouTube, which is potentially embarrassing. But often when I think about the idea of Future Ready, it's got some sort of hype associated with it. There's something about it that is a bit hyped, and I wanted to just look at a couple of the reasons why I think that maybe there's a bit of hype associated with it. And part of the hype, I think, is about this idea here, that Future Ready is about preparing graduates for an unknown future, and that means multiple careers and mobility between jobs. The idea that we're no longer going to train or be educated in an institution and then come out and have a single job for the 45 or 50 years that you work, despite me currently being in my job for 20 years and seem destined to never leave the University of Melbourne. But leaving that aside, the second thing is preparing people for jobs that don't exist, like the idea that we can't envisage what jobs are going to be in existence in 5 or 10 years or 15 years' time. So what does it mean for our education system now if we're preparing graduates for a future that we can't quite see? And there's also, and this is where it does get a little bit hypey, something about the workforce being replaced by automation. So I wouldn't want to be living in Ethiopia and less concerning, I think, in the UK with 35%. And I came across this website, which some of you might know from the BBC, Will a Robot Take Your Job? So I don't know whether it's narcissism or I immediately went in to try and work out and was gratified to think that, I mean, that's a great news story for us. Teaching another I just love to get the analytics on that to see what profession people in it immediately go to. So that's Future Ready. And this, though, I think is not hyped so much. It's not part of the hype. About ideas about Future Ready, about preparing students where things like literacies, competencies and qualities that they're going to need to be carried into the work environment in the future that are sort of immutable or don't change so much. They're foundational skills that we would like to see inculcated in our graduates in some way, shape or form. And so when I was thinking about some of those ideas about what it is to be future ready, in a way, particularly those last slides about skills, in a way, sort of #FutureReady through the Sandstone Institution all the way back to Cardinal Newman about the idea of the university. I think some of the ideas about Future Ready have always been thus for a university. It raises questions about what it is that we do at a university. What is a university for? And really, those questions have been facing people such as yourself and educators all throughout time. And so when I think about what it is a university is for, when I showed this slide to my daughter Audrey, she looked at the title and said, "What is a university for?" That's obvious. And I said, "Oh, well, what do you think a university is for?" She didn't see the blue boxes. And she said, "It's so that you can get a job." And then I showed her the blue boxes and she said, "Oh yeah." And then I showed her this, which is what I'm going to be talking about. We're in a teaching and learning community. And she said, "Oh yeah, but they're the stuff that you do on the way to getting a job." She's 12. So I think that there's an interesting question that we need to confront and think about and talk through, which is these ideas about what a university is for have been around for a long time. So this is one of my favourite ones, a guy called Andrew Norton, who's a higher education researcher in the Grattan Institute in Melbourne in Australia. And it's the classic, people know the mind, money, marriage idea of why do you go to university? Mind, money, marriage. And so here's the mind, here's the money, and here's the marriage. The idea is that you go to university to learn new things, whether that's specific things or generic things or practical training, to get a job, to get a qualification and a credential that awards you a recognition so that you can go out and work in a profession. And then the hang out on campus, have a good time, meet people, get drunk, smoke a bit of dope, have a bit of a student lifestyle, but also potentially meet the person that you're going to marry or the person that you're going to start a business with. And these kind of ideas, mind and money, are relatively well researched. So this is a first-year experience survey from the university, from across Australia, and shows you the kind of things that this is large samples of incoming first-year students about what they think is important. So you can see that interest is important, but also jobs are important. But interestingly, in a study that was not a study, an article that was just released, Thornton McCamish wrote it, was reflecting on the changes in the ways in which these attitudes, with college students, with university students are potentially changing. So the stat up there, it's a lot of text, but in 1967, 86% of respondents considered developing a meaningful philosophy of life was one of the most important reasons. Double the number who've ticked the idea of being well off financially. And interestingly, that is completely reversed over those 40 or 50 years, so that now it's 82% prioritise the money side of things and 45% about developing some meaningful philosophy of life. So in a way, I think this is unsurprising when you think about some of the changes that have happened in higher education, certainly in Australia, but worldwide. Some of the pressures and changes that we've had in higher education in political terms and in social terms. And some of them are up on the screen and I'll rip through them pretty quickly. So we've moved, certainly in the Australian context, in the last 25 years from an elite to a mass participation higher education system, which is where the state is funding higher education to a lesser degree. They're allocating less resources, which means universities look beyond state funding and beyond the public purse, which often means deregulation of fees or access into the university. These are all familiar things, I'm sure, to you, which means, in the UK, this happened noticeably recently, students are paying a greater proportion of the costs of their studying. And so in that context of this squeeze, political economic squeeze, students and their parents are reasonably wanting tangible outcomes. The whole system was tilted vocationally towards more vocational education in that time, and it became a bun fight for students. It's very competitive nationally, it's very competitive internationally, and that's one of the foundational changes in the higher education sectors across the world. I hope that sort of resonates with people, yeah? I'm not talking things that you don't understand. So I get to this point often in many of my talks, and I go, well, that's all wonderful context, but so what? What's all that about? What does that mean? What's the point of all that? And so I'll try and summarise that in this slide by saying, when thinking about hashtag future ready, many of the notions of future ready throw up really perennial questions for universities about why they exist. And that last slide, recent pressures and changes, when you sort of put them all together and you combine them, that's meant that the traditional reasons for going to university, the things that when we think about the sandstone walls and when you think about the old movies and you think about Cardinal Newman, the reasons for going to university have maybe become, traditional reasons have become less prominent in our discussions. And while many, or probably, I'm not sure, but it would be good to talk in the coffee queue, most of us find it hard to forsake those traditional notions of what it is or what it means to go to university. The individual, the society and the government have set expectations that means that the conversation about going to university and what it means to be future ready is really dominated by preparing graduates for employment. So that there's been a change in that. And this was brought home to me as I was standing at Birmingham, where was it? Birmingham Station? Birmingham International Station, waiting for the train to get onto Telford, to get up to Telford. And this sign here, which you probably, maybe you're familiar with, but can't read, and it says lovely things about the institution, which sound wonderful, but it's never surprising to see this now in advertising material of university. And you stole my gag. And I didn't need the slide. But it's not particular to this institution. It's so common in the advertising now that institutions will spruik and basically say, come to this university, we'll guarantee you employment. So what I want to structure the talk around, the rest of the talk around, is this idea of two competing philosophies. When it comes, and I'm going to focus just on teaching and learning and assessment, when it comes to teaching and learning assessment, contemporary universities are really running two systems. One which they find very difficult to give away, and one which they feel that they really have to embrace. And for want of a better term, I'm going to call them the thinker philosophy and the worker philosophy. And what I want to do is I want to set those two philosophies up, and then I want to talk about these three areas and look at each of the cells, albeit briefly, and the ways in thinking about teaching and learning. What is the focus of teaching and learning? How do we engage in teaching and learning? How do we do it? And what's the outcome of teaching, learning and assessment? And so I want to go through each of these cells and briefly give you a small argument about that. I want to unpack it and reflect on it just a little bit. Is this making sense so far? It's making sense to Shane. That was an emphatic So, we're in quadrant 1, thinker philosophy. What is the focus? What do we focus on here? And this is arguably what we focus on, the canon, you know. Does everybody know, who wrote Moby Dick? Thank you, I could never remember that. Inferno, Hamlet, Shakespeare, Pride and Prejudice, the canon. Depending on your discipline, the focus of the thinker philosophy is on the core content, whatever your discipline, and the canon within that. And what we try and do in the thinker philosophy, in terms of what our focus is engage people in referential thinking, is get them to elaborative thinking, get them to think and join things together, get them to broaden out and connect things across philosophy and literature and psychology and sociology, or whatever it is. In this case, it's in the earth sciences. So there's this idea of broadening out the individual rather than restricting the individual. And this is captured, I don't know if anyone knows Perry. Do people know Perry? I find Perry really sort of compelling and slightly spooky, but really, he came up with these stages of intellectual and ethical development, which is about the kinds of thinking that we want to encourage in our students as they progress through their undergraduate years. And there's the taxonomy from dualism to commitment within relativism. And dualism is basically students come into the university thinking there's a right and wrong, there's a black and white answer for things. They move on to multiplicity, they recognise that more than one opinion exists and that they more than one solution exists for a particular problem and there are many options. Relativism is that those viewpoints exist in a contextual world, and really whichever one holds the fray is based on some sort of evidence. And the final one is having a personal commitment within that relativism framework. And so the idea of the thinker philosophy and what the focus is on is to move people through this in a sort of raw way, through the continuum, down to somebody who's committed to, has commitments within relativism. So that's sort of a snatch of the thinker philosophy. And when you think about that, you can contrast it with a worker philosophy, which is slightly different. The focus is on professional skills. The focus is seen in contrast in many ways. So the thinker philosophy is about a theory, where the worker philosophy is about practice. It's about professional skills, it's about useful things, it's about being more specific rather than more elaborative, and being more targeted in what we want our students to get out of the educational experience. What about how we engage in teaching and learning? When you think about the thinker philosophy, this is often what would come to mind in terms of how we educate our students. On the lawn, in small group teachings, if you're lucky enough to get a small group tutorial or a one-on-one with your professor, large group teaching. So it's very much on campus, in classroom is the thinker philosophy. And we match that with a whole range of technology tools. We've got our physical environments here on campus, in classroom, with academic scholarly environment. And we match those with a range of what are relatively broad, raw, enterprise teaching and learning system tools. Things like learning management systems, academic integrity systems, lecture capture systems and the like. These things are really good for content, consistent with the thinker philosophy, which is dominated by content. They're good at delivering content and they're good at managing content. If you contrast that maybe with the worker philosophy, the learning doesn't happen on campus in classrooms. It happens beyond campus, in the real world, whether that's a placement on some sort of, in the zoo or on a farm or an agricultural site. Many people here would know this is a familiar placement scenario in a hospital, in a healthcare provider, or downtown, within law or economics. So the idea about the worker philosophy here is that people go out beyond the academic scholarly community. And similarly, while the physical environment changed, many of the tools and technologies that you might support people in those environments change. Yeah, you might have a learning management system to tie everything back to home base, but other things that would be familiar to, obviously PebblePad, but boutique software that is within the context of that particular workplace environment, and broadening things like Google Docs. Finally, the last one, which is, what is the outcome? And this is one which I think is where a little bit more tension exists. So when we think about the academic, content-focused thinker philosophy, this is classically how we think of the outcome. We shove people into a big fat room, we put them on a really teeny tiny desk, and we sit them there for 2.5 or 3 hours, and we summatively assess them. And that's fundamentally what we do in terms of outcome in a mass higher education system. And what we're trying to divine is sort of the knowledge that's inside their head. We're trying to, through that process, trying to work out with some sort of warranty, some sort of credentialing system. We're trying to get at the knowledge, and the university is trying to find the knowledge that's inside this dude's head. And where it ends is a transcript and a testama and a degree. That's the outcome. That's the fundamental outcome of the thinker philosophy. And this warrants what you know. This is the university saying, I've assessed you and I've warranted that you know something. And let's contrast that with the worker philosophy, which is much more about the individual gathering evidence of what their experiences, their activities, their reflections are, showing in some way the skills and competencies, and using various tools and techniques, badges, micro-credentials, or simply a portfolio that they create to warrant their experience, warrant their activities, and warrant their reflections. So, does that make sense? Not so many years that time. So it's a bit of a bald taxonomy, it's a bit of a harsh reading, but this is the summary. The thinker philosophy focused on theory, the content, canon, practice and referential thinking. The work of philosophy more practice-focused, professional skills and targeted. How we engage, classroom, campus, academic world using monolithic content delivery tools like Blackboard. Workplace, off-campus, real world using more flexible tools, maybe like PebblePad. And then the outcome is the institution summatively examining the knowledge inside somebody's head, so the university can get evidence that you know something, so I can give you a transcript and a degree. And the other side is the collection of some sort of skills and competencies, individual badges through a portfolio. And I think that there is a tension here, going back to the start of the talk. I think that there's sometimes within our institutions a tension between those two sides. What it is that we're meant to be doing with our students. But at the same time, and this is where the talk is a little bit, goes sideways, and it might sound like I'm having my cake and eating it too, where I'm not intending to do that, but I really want to try to articulate that there are tensions here, but in a way the boundaries between these things, it's a bit of a false dichotomy. And hopefully I evoked in you people going, don't know that that's quite right, that sounds a little bit like that's not the way I would think about it. So I agree with that. I think that the boundaries between these two philosophies are often blurred, and in many ways it's a false dichotomy. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to try and work out our position on them and try and negotiate them in some way. And so we want to try and pick up on some of these. That's a typo on dichotomy. It's atrocious. What? That's all right. So what I want to do is try and pick up some of where the tensions but elements are. I highly recommend this article by Louis Menard, Live and Learn. Is that what it's called? Live and Learn, in the New Yorker. He's a great writer, and it's an article that I'm not going to do justice to here. But I really do feel that this quote captures what he's saying in the article, is that there is this tension, and we have, you know, much of the historical background that I gave you over the last 20 to 30 years. He says, right, so if I'm teaching at a state institution in the States, and the degree is about educating state troopers to give them a credential, state troopers like police, why do I need to teach them the canon? Why do I need to teach them Henry James? Do I do that just, I love it, so that they can show that they can tough it out with Henry James? What's it adding towards their experience and their degree? So that's one side of the tension. But on the other side, equally, we of course want people who come out of an arts degree to go off and work somewhere, and equally we want people who are studying for a professional degree to think clearly and carefully and creatively and adeptly about what they're doing, so that there is a blurred boundary here. And on the second one about how we engage, this one I think is more compelling for me. Regardless of the philosophy, we want learning to be deeply engaging, to be interactive, to be meaningful, to be technology supported. And we have great models that I'm sure you're aware of that allow us to frame and design learning environments that support that. So it's not that these models have a lock on either side. What we're increasingly seeing is, in courses that are predominantly campus-based in undergraduate studies, is inquiry-based, discovery-based, authentic, collaborative. All these learning designs are being used in the sandstone institutions of the world because they're recognised as good learning design. They're recognised as ways in which we can create learning environments that are deeply engaging and interactive and meaningful, where students will learn something. And things like authentic or situated or apprenticeship models of learning, they're the stuff of what happens outside on placements in other forms of education beyond the sandstone wall. So regardless of the philosophy, we think learning is good learning when it comes to design, and these models resonate with both sides of the continuum, or of the dichotomy. And at the University of Melbourne, this is something that, in my PVC role, I've got this awful job at the moment. We're recording this. It's okay, Vice-Chancellor. It's a great job. An awful job, which is about whole of institutional change in what's called flexible academic programming, which is looking at the ways in which we structure curriculum across a range of things. One of the streams that I'm leading is on curriculum structure and approach. And the way in which we're thinking about that is in the ecosystem that we have, which is large group lectures, tutorials, work integrated learning, research experiences and online experience with assessment sort of driving everything. We're thinking actively about what it is about how we do these things and balance what I call the graphic equaliser of that ecosystem to try and work out what's the best harmony that we can get between these elements, and is that different from first year to third year? Is that difference for science students and art students? Is that difference for graduate law students as opposed to undergraduate design students? And we think it is. So these things are actively being played with in curriculum design at the moment. And of course, when it comes to decisions that you will make, if there is a blending, you're not just having people in classrooms in large group lectures, you're sending them out, you're asking them to do interesting things on placement. You're seeing them in their graduate medical program. They only spend 1 year on campus and then they're in clinic for the rest of the time. You want to have those physical environments matched with a suite of tools that need to intersect to support those kind of pedagogical activities so that you blend that thinker and that worker philosophy. And the final one, where I think that there is a bit of tension and I will spend a little bit more time on, is the third one, which is the outcome. And many of you, I expect, would be familiar with some of the tensions that are really contemporary tensions at the moment in the higher education landscape, which is what is the value of a university degree? Like those folks from North America went through the film Ivory Tower. People know the film Ivory Tower. There was a huge kerfuffle in the States, particularly about really very costly degrees and what is the value in terms of employability, particularly, that students are getting out of these degrees. And when you boil a lot of that argument down, is that as institutions, we've relied very heavily on the idea of the transcript and the degree as a proxy, not just for the thinker philosophy, but also the worker philosophy. And we assume that employers assume, that the degree and the testama is valued and is a valuable warrant for the outcomes of both philosophies, that someone can think and someone can do professionally what they're meant to be able to do in the workplace. And at the moment that assumption is being challenged. So the reason is that we have a Bachelor of Arts from this institution, and those things are a sign and a symbol of all of those skills. That's what we've relied on in the past, that people are just going to accept that that's the case. And that goes back to Norton's Mind, Money and Marriage. It really is, once you get this and you've got this in your hand, it's meant to represent all of these things. And people at the moment are saying, just not sure that they represent all those things. University degrees are irrelevant to big employers. And go one further, this is from a blog, and I've forgotten the name, maybe colleagues from North America tell me where a WCET is. It's an ed tech group from a particular province or state in the... I'll give you just a little chance to read that so I can get some water. But I like this idea of trust bust, because I think it captures gin and tonic, mate. So the idea of the trust bust here is that we're facing the trust bust, is that there's this no longer this acceptance that you would trust us, that the degree is going to represent something. And I like this, transcripts are too opaque and no longer being used. A wake-up call that the education community has to drastically rethink how we demonstrate students' learning and credential their achievement. And so I think there's two things going on here, and the first is less important than the second. The first is that what these kind of arguments and the posts and the newspaper articles are saying, and this is a classic, is that content and expertise, that the degrees and transcripts don't reveal or correspond to both a content expertise. There's something missing in the actual curriculum. This happened to me all the time when I was in medicine. When you move to a problem-based curriculum, you rip out a whole lot of content because you're asking students to do much more self-directed learning and you're not doing so much instruction. And you'd hang out with the people that were in the hospitals, the senior physicians, and they'd say, no one understands any bloody anatomy anymore. What are you teaching these people? Or they've never read Marx. They're coming out of an arts degree. They haven't read Marx. What's going on? And you're saying, well, they've read Madonna and they've done, they've done some great work on Marx, but they've never read Marx. And so there's a content problem. I think that's less important than the second one, which is that the trust bust is about specific skills and competencies and qualities in our graduates that employers think are required in the workplace that should allow both the individual and the industry to thrive. And if someone comes out and says, I've got an X degree from University X and here's my degree in transcript, employers are saying, we don't see all those skills that we think should go along with that degree. And that's where the trust bust is. And that, I wanted to use voila, because I think Tracy's got a tattoo of French on the inside of her arm. Is that true?
It is true.
There you go.
I am ready.
I am ready. There it is. So that's why these skills are so important in terms of prominence, going back to the start of the talk. And not so much these, not that they're unimportant, but these competencies, these skills, these idea of the ability to learn, the ability to be adapt, the ability to be creative, the ability, as Shane said to me the other day, to unlearn something. Those kind of skills are the skills that employers are looking for in graduates in this future-ready idea, the idea that we're preparing people to be not just a thinker or a worker, but something more. And, of course, which is why these things are so prominent in our landscape, why Mozilla Open Badges is prominent, and why a university in my local context, Deakin University, has set up a badging program to say, we'll give you a degree in business, but you can also work to get discipline-specific or global citizenship or communication skills or creativity skills. And that is why, in this context, these things are rising in prominence. But there's some more tension. So I can understand how that happens, but I think that there's a danger here. And the danger is that if we focus and narrow too much on these specific skills, these badges and micro skills, we may be doing a disservice to our students. And this is a tilt back towards that thinker philosophy. And the example that I'll use is that a friend of mine, Quentin Cutts, he doesn't do this anymore, but when I was in Glasgow, he was teaching a computing program. And what he intentionally did, which is why there's an old computer on the screen, what he intentionally did when he was teaching these students at the height of the dot-com boom that all came out and said, I want to be a programmer in Java, or I want to do web programming. He intentionally chose a programming language to educate them that wasn't the cool language of the day. Because what he wanted to do is he wanted to show students how to program through principles and concepts, so that if they got the foundational core principles associated with programming, regardless of the language, then they would be able to, and he asked them to apply that to a whole range of different problems, work out how to make the bags come out of the airport more efficiently, or work out how to move this robot across the page, or whatever it was. By applying the principles from this old, dead programming language, he allowed students to understand the fundamental concepts, the core values of what it is to be a programmer. And then when they go out, they can apply those to the cool languages of the day. So that if we narrow too much and we say, all right, we're going to give students in our institution an education in language X so they can become an app developer. Who knows if apps are going to be around in 20 years' time? We do them a disservice. So there is a danger associated with narrowing. So I suppose for me the argument comes back to, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater on this. We want credentials, of course. If somebody is going to operate on my knee when I get back, now that Shane has told me I need to do that, I want them to be credentialed. I want them to have a degree. I want them to understand something of anatomy, and I want them to have gone through a system where somebody says, you're good to go. If somebody is building a bridge that I'm going to drive over with my family, I want them to be as proud as this woman standing in front of that bridge saying, I've got a degree of engineering and you can trust this bridge that I'm on. So it's not like we don't want credentials. So this is the second so what. And this is really going to try and wrap it up so that we can have some time for questions. The so what comes back to going back to the start. I made an argument that we've sort of got two philosophies running at the moment when it comes to teaching and learning and assessment in contemporary universities. The thinker, the worker, one that they can't give away and one that we have to embrace. And I've said that there's some complementarity between them, but also some tension between them, and hopefully that's come across. And so I feel happy. I've fulfilled the remit of the title of the talk. I'm good. But what does that mean? What are you going to do with it? And this is where I think that I'm going to tell you guys how to suck eggs. I'm really going to say some things that I think that you probably know already, but hopefully the framing of them is useful to you. And it's really only 4 things that I think that we have to do. And so as an institution, as universities, these are things that are under active consideration by me and my portfolios. Universities of the future that will have success in preparing graduates for future ready will actively intertwine this thinker and lurker philosophy in teaching and learning and assessment. And the balance of those things will depend on the type of institution that you are. I'm not a Pollyanna to think that every institution is the same. I don't think every institution is an Oxbridge type institution. And I think that the balance will depend on the focus, the remit and the mission of the institution. And more than that, the balance might actually change within the institution depending on what discipline area you're talking about, what kind of students you have. And I think that we should all, some people get a little bit religious about this, and I think that that's all okay for those kind of tensions to exist within the sector and within the institution. I think the most important thing is that we talk about it and that we acknowledge what we're doing in our curriculum structures, which takes me to the second point. And again, this is money for jam for you guys. To meet the challenge of success in preparing future-ready graduates, the way in which we will do this is through really thoughtful, careful, thorough curriculum, syllabus, learning activity and assessment design. You can't leave it to chance. If you are going to do this intertwining and make decisions about it, it needs to be designed carefully and then implemented carefully. And there are known challenges here. There are things that we know about. The most obvious one for me is the packed curriculum problem. Does anyone feel the packed curriculum problem? How do we fit it all in? How do we organise it? Which bits do we prioritise? Does the thinker philosophy get pushed to one side so we can do more of the worker stuff? How do we embed work integrated learning within those what are traditional thinker programs? How do you do that in an arts degree? How and when and what end to end do we embed the canon into those professional degrees? And we've got some challenging questions here which I don't think I've resolved in my own mind, which is to what extent do we need somebody to read William James or to understand Freud or to read Marx within particular degrees? Success will be universities that recognise, warrant and allow students to demonstrate a variety of different types of skills and knowledge, or nils and scholage, at different levels. So I think that we're good at the top with the degree, and we're not bad at intra-degree with the major, the minor, the specialisation. And where it's starting to shake out is these 21st century literacies, competencies and qualities, and then specific professional skills. How do we recognise and allow students to recognise and warrant those skills? So we need to find better ways of doing this within curricula and alongside curricula, so that teachers are able to teach them, even though that's a dirty word in some ways. But I think that this is really important and has come up in conversations back home and also at the conference. I think that we've got to get a better way of allowing students to appreciate the skills that they themselves are learning so that they can then articulate those skills to other people. And I don't think that we do that particularly well. And I think that preparing students for future ready, if you're worried about employability, then asking students and allowing them to appreciate, demonstrate and articulate those skills within their programs is a critical factor in the success of that employability. And finally, technology-based tools to assist both the institution and the individual will be critical. I don't know what they are. I know we're at a PebblePad conference, but I don't know what they are. But they will be able to be about allowing the individual to capture, to document, and giving the institution the power to support their development of an evidentiary base for a range of those different types of skills. So I think, to close, that the balance between these things, between the thinker and the worker philosophy, I've set up a straw man, a false dichotomy really, and what I've tried to do in the talk is to navigate some of the tensions, to see where there's complementarity, but to see where I think that there are real tensions. But I think it's important to find a balance between these two philosophies, because of course we want to avoid this. There's no one that is going to argue that this is not important to us as educators in higher education sector. But also I think we need to find some sort of balance to ensure that we don't tilt the system too far towards the worker philosophy. As I said at the start of the talk, I think there's a danger that this is happening given the conversation that we're having at the moment in the higher education sector. You know, I think that there is some danger that employability is dominating some of the conversations about what it means to go to university. And so we don't want our higher education system to become too employment focused with degrees, I think, that are too narrow and specific. So in a way, I think that what we want to do is not turn away from that, but make a stronger argument for why the thinker philosophy is still important. And I suppose one of the reasons that I think it's particularly relevant today is because some of the issues that we're facing in a community, as a society, I think a couple of those issues up there on the screen, they really require a thinker philosophy. They might not get you there with a really specific and narrow worker philosophy. And by continuing to develop our graduates with a fair whack of that thinker philosophy, I think that we'll prepare them to tackle these issues. And I think that that's really what higher education must continue to do. And it must have a sort of an essential role in making our graduates future ready. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Gregor. That was excellent. I really appreciate the that thinker worker dichotomy. Oh, well, it's not a dichotomy.
It's not a dichotomy.
No, it's not a dichotomy.
It's a dichotomy that's not a dichotomy.
Yeah. But I can already think about how I can use that in my conversations with customers about what we do as well, and the way we use tools and things like that. So I find that really useful. We've got about under 10 minutes for questions. So
anyone except for Shane.
Yeah, I was going to say. Shane, do you want to start the ball rolling?
Well, I've got about 14 questions, so I'm going to try and roll into one. And it's something around, I think the key worker skill is a thinking skill. And that whole thing about theory is, to most of us, the theory is useless unless it's also contextualised in practice. And then there's something about those theories in practice evolving. As learners, we make sense of them and discard old ones, embrace new ones, synthesize ideas. And the question then is, and this relates to what we were talking about yesterday, I think, in thinking about Julie's presentation, and I think a lot we'll see over the next 2 days, is the role of the practitioner in that, the teacher, the coach, the mentor, in asking questions and being involved in conversation and helping the learner. And of course that doesn't discard peer networks and that kind of thing, but helping them understand those theories in practice.
Yeah.
And then so there's the question about scaling up.
Yep, that's what I was going to go.
That was an issue that you had yesterday. So how, for us as a community where we're passionate about it, I think because we are all teachers, how does that work at scale?
So I think that there's two things there. I don't disagree with you at all about the theory applied in practice. And I think that the difficulty is that often we only give one half of the equation with our students. There's impoverished theory and straight to practice, or there's too much theory and no practice. And so the link is the important bit. The second part of the question, so I agree with that. The second part of the question is something about the ways in which the fundamental role of teachers in higher education, or any education really, and that I think that with the mass education system, and I've given talks on this, we're in danger with the scale of the system, being a little bit technocentric and thinking that we can capture teachers in technology, is that we're sidelining teachers and the teaching practice out of the pedagogical equation, where what we talked about yesterday is the idea of offloading teaching to something else, either a bot or a system or whatever it is. Or sometimes a junior staff member that is maybe not what we haven't given enough support to provide that advice. So I think that it's a really tricky and problem for higher education at the moment, because as we expand, is finding ways that you can maintain dialogue, interaction, exchange, the fundamental role of the teacher in seeing, recognising, coaching, guiding, facilitating, cajoling, questioning, demanding, all of those skills that a teacher brings to the fore in the classroom. There is a real danger that we lose those most important skills out of the enterprise of teaching and learning as we scale up. And so we've got to work hard to maintain it. Does that answer the question? It's just a nice reflection on the question.
It reinforces it. I mean, it's a challenge, and I think that challenge will be aired, I think, during the sessions we see here, and we get that question delivered to us. How do we scale this up?
So there are ways that you can do it. If I want to be more positive, there are ways you can do it technologically, which people are thinking about. So as difficult as it is, the enterprise of teaching and learning, and don't get me wrong about that particular word enterprise, but if you know what I mean by the enterprise of teaching and learning, the discussion of teaching and learning, the conversation of teaching and learning, if you break it down and look at the micro exchanges associated with that, often some of the things that the expert teacher is engaging with aren't pedagogically related. They're technically related, they're administratively related, often. And so one of the ways in which technology can help is that you can triage the interactions so that you have, for things like when's the assignment due, what's the word limit, how do I think about why does PDF Reader not work? If you can find ways that you can triage the interactions between the expert teacher and the student such that only pedagogical interactions are happening there, and you offload administrative and technical, is one way that you can start to get more scale in the system, because your precious resource is the expertise, both in terms of content and pedagogical practice of the teacher, and don't make that person the person that's providing technical and administrative advice about when the essay is due. That's one way. Yep.
I can't help but think about the role of assessment in all of this, because in the United States, particularly for K-12 education, assessment is driving the curriculum. In other words, what they're going to be tested on at the end is what the curriculum needs to be about. And so, and I look around this conference, and a lot of us are from the health field and the education field, and what we have in common is this really important practice piece. But we usually assess things because they're easy to assess.
Yep.
And not necessarily because they're the most important things that we want our students to have outcomes.
Yep.
So I think that the fields of education and nursing or health can do a lot to help other programs look at alternative ways to assess, because we have that practice kind of clinical piece that a lot of other university programs don't have. So.
Yeah, so my two backgrounds are health sciences and education, so I sort of agree with you. To say that they're limited, and I'm not saying that you think that, I'll take the second bit first. There are many, many disciplines that have that practice piece if you think about architecture or design, or there are bits in law, engineering. There's a lot of places that have that practice component. So, but that's not to say that often the lead runners here are in education and the health sciences. You're spot on about assessment. So a lot of the slides about the lecture hall and the trying to work out, universities, because of scale and because of efficiencies, are obsessed with trying to work out what are fundamentally often not very useful things about what's inside somebody's head through multiple choice questions. And that means that students will quite reasonably think about what it is that is going to be assessed to allow them to get through and work backwards from that point. Now, we know that that's not particularly good pedagogical practice, and we know that the way to resolve that is to constructively align the curriculum in a way so that there's a better alignment between assessment and the learning activities and the learning objectives, but then change the assessment so that it's developmental assessment, it's process-oriented assessment, it's authentic assessment. And then you get to that point, and then you come up to my office and you say, I want to do process-oriented developmental assessment with 2,000 biology students. And I'm like, yeah, right. Who's going to fund that? Like, I've got no money for it. You've got no time for it. And we're in the same bind of resourcing. And so that means that you need to think really, and we've got some solutions in place where you need to think really cleverly about scalable, authentic, alternative assessment models. And people are starting to work hard on this, and you work back from that. And sometimes students really appreciate it.
Quick question?
More a comment. I came all the way from Melbourne to...
Oh, really?
I'm from the other university, Monash. and thank you for such a fabulous presentation. But I think, to use that happy phrase, elephant in the room, the threat to the thinking, that balance, because it's been the heart of everything I've been doing for the last 30 years, is the funding model for universities. And the fact that now, I was shocked to learn last week at a conference at Sheffield Hallam that the average health student will be paying £9,000 a year for their tuition, which is double the HECS. I'm thinking, no wonder they want employment at the end of it. And I worry that it's all of us, I think, got through uni for nothing. And
I didn't.
Well,
I was at the start of HECS.
well, I actually come from here originally. I had training in the old-fashioned way and got £6 a week. Very long time ago. But I do worry that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I'm watching this debate around grammar schools. It's all
Exactly.
Oh my God, the poor people are actually getting jobs. That's terrible. They're getting into the academy. We've got to. So I worry about it.
No, so I mean, and Shane and I were talking about this, I think, the other day about the fundamental, I might not have been with you, Shane, but the fundamental in the Australian context and to a certain extent here, and you see this, the Teaching Excellence Framework here is another sort of sign and symbol of what's happening in the policy landscape. So that it's a fundamentally broken system because it's because of the cross-subsidy between teaching and learning and research. The research drives the rankings drive the students don't really come to an institution for teaching and learning, and we're in this vicious cycle where we've never got enough money for teaching and learning. So the way, and the article that I put up about Thornton McCamish, Richard James, who's a colleague back at Melbourne Uni, who's quite an expert in the area, makes a very eloquent argument about having a stern conversation. Who was I having this conversation with? It was you, wasn't it, Tracy? About differentiation within and across the sector, so within the institutions and across the sector, which other societies do. You know, go to Japan, go to Finland, go to different places, they do it incredibly well. In the Australian context, everybody is a university and we suffer that yoke every day. If you had differentiation between institutions, it would make this much better because people would go to high quality teaching institutions and get great jobs, and the researchers could go off and disappear into the labs, and everybody would be happy in my Pollyanna world.
All right, unfortunately we have to stop it there, but Gregor's going to be here for the whole conference, so lots of opportunity to have further conversations with him, so please take advantage of that. So can I first thank Gregor again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.